Hey friends, I'm Megan, so glad you're here. We've got a great episode today. Let's get started.
The day he received the promotion was meant to be a moment of celebration, a milestone that reflected years of hard work, dedication, and personal sacrifice. He had been anticipating sharing the news with her, imagining her excitement, pride, and acknowledgement as a vital part of marking this achievement. For him, recognition from the person closest to him carried as much weight as the promotion itself, a tangible affirmation that his efforts were seen, valued, and appreciated in the context of their shared life. Yet, as he shared the news, her response, or more accurately, the lack thereof, did not match the significance of the occasion. She had been distracted, caught up in the rhythms and pressures of daily life, perhaps preoccupied with her own obligations or thoughts, and in that moment she failed to fully register the gravity of what he had accomplished. Her mind had not immediately connected the importance of the promotion with the emotional weight it carried for him, and the subtle lapse in attention created a fissure in the moment that he could not ignore. From her perspective, it had seemed like an ordinary day, another item in the endless list of tasks, responsibilities, and interactions that consumed her attention. Yet she had underestimated the symbolic and relational impact of the omission. She had not deliberately ignored him. It was an oversight, a momentary lapse in mindfulness, but its consequences were anything but negligible. As he absorbed her muted response, the subtle disappointment began to emerge in his demeanor, a careful restraint, a quiet withdrawal, a hesitation in his voice that contrasted sharply with the pride and excitement that had defined his announcement. She noticed these cues with a delayed awareness, a creeping realization that her inattention had shifted the emotional tone of the interaction. She reflected on the nature of recognition, considering how it functions not merely as acknowledgement of an achievement but as validation of presence, effort, and relational significance. In that instant, the promotion was no longer just a professional milestone. It had become a mirror reflecting her attentiveness, empathy, and emotional investment in the partnership. She began to confront the subtle ways in which daily distractions, habitual preoccupations, and unintentional oversight can erode relational intimacy over time, how moments that seem minor to one partner can hold profound meaning for the other, and how failure to acknowledge those moments can generate feelings of invisibility, underappreciation, or emotional distance. The chapter explored her growing awareness of this relational nuance, emphasizing that recognition is not optional in maintaining connection. It is a crucial component of trust, mutual respect, and emotional alignment. She considered the mental and emotional dimensions of the interaction, noting the tension between her personal focus and the relational impact of her response, the gap between intention and perception, and the quiet but potent consequences of her oversight. In retrospect, she could see the missed opportunity for affirmation, celebration, and shared joy, recognizing that these moments serve as both emotional currency and relational glue, binding partners together through acknowledgement, attention, and empathy. As she reflected further, she understood that her initial inattention had introduced a subtle shift in their dynamic, creating the first ripple in a chain of relational consequences that could influence his perception of connection, value, and emotional visibility. She began to anticipate the potential trajectory of these consequences, recognizing that unacknowledged achievements, if left unaddressed, can accumulate into broader patterns of perceived neglect or emotional distance. The chapter concluded with a heightened sense of awareness, a recognition of the delicate interplay between daily attention, relational mindfulness, and the emotional resonance of acknowledgement, setting the stage for the deeper exploration of internal reflection, subtle relational cues, and the necessity of deliberate, empathetic engagement that would follow in subsequent chapters. In the hours and days following the promotion announcement, she began to notice subtle but undeniable shifts in his behavior, a quiet distance that had not existed before. The initial excitement that had filled their interactions now seemed tempered, as if her delayed or muted acknowledgement had caused him to question the depth of her engagement, the sincerity of her support, or even the priority of their relationship in her life. She observed how small gestures, once effortless and reciprocal, now required more conscious effort on his part, how casual conversations carried a weight of hesitation, and how the shared energy between them had diminished, replaced by a tentative rhythm that left her uneasy. Internally, she began to analyze her own responses, tracing back to the moment of oversight and recognizing the inadvertent signals she had sent. What had felt like a minor lapse, a distraction in the flow of daily routines, now revealed itself as a subtle but potent disruption to relational equilibrium. She reflected on the psychology of recognition and its role in sustaining emotional intimacy, understanding that acknowledgement is not merely a formality but a communicative act that conveys care, respect, and validation of the other's efforts. The absence of such acknowledgement, even for seemingly small milestones, can seed doubt, creating the perception of disinterest or emotional distance that can grow silently over time. She began to perceive the impact of her inattention on his emotional landscape, moments of hesitation, guarded enthusiasm, or muted pride that hinted at feelings of being unseen or unappreciated. Each observation sharpened her awareness of the relational consequences, illustrating how sensitive human connections are to cues of recognition, attention, and emotional reciprocity. Her reflections delved into her own patterns of distraction, habitual preoccupation, and prioritization of immediate tasks over relational mindfulness, acknowledging how these tendencies had contributed to the current state. Emotionally, she navigated a mixture of guilt, regret, and growing empathy, recognizing that her failure to celebrate his achievement had inadvertently communicated a lack of attention or care, regardless of her intentions. She considered the accumulation of small oversights, how minor omissions can compound over time, subtly eroding the sense of value and security that underpins intimate partnerships. Her mind traced through the ways in which she might have corrected the situation earlier, pondering the missed opportunities for verbal acknowledgement, shared celebration, or thoughtful gestures that could have reinforced connection and affirmed his significance in her life. The chapter explored the interplay between perception and intention, illustrating how the absence of conscious acknowledgement can misalign relational expectations and create gaps in mutual understanding. She realized that the consequences of her inattention extended beyond the immediate moment, influencing his perception of their emotional alignment, his sense of visibility and validation, and the implicit trust in her attentiveness to shared milestones. In contemplating these dynamics, she began to construct a roadmap for awareness, recognition, and proactive engagement, understanding that addressing subtle relational fractures requires both internal reflection and deliberate external action. She also examined the broader emotional mechanisms at play, how human beings are acutely attuned to signals of recognition, how the failure to acknowledge accomplishments can be internalized as disinterest, and how relational confidence depends on consistent, intentional reinforcement of care and attention. By the end of the chapter, she had developed a deepened understanding of the significance of her oversight, the nuances of his emotional response, and the critical role of acknowledgement in sustaining intimacy, trust, and relational vitality. The stage was set for her to engage in deliberate reflection and action, to bridge the growing gap, and to navigate the complex process of restoring emotional alignment and mutual validation in the partnership. As her awareness of the consequences of her oversight deepened, she found herself immersed in a profound internal reflection on the dynamics of attention, acknowledgement, and emotional connection within their relationship. She began to revisit the promotion announcement in her mind, analyzing not only her delayed or muted response, but also the layers of meaning that her inaction had conveyed. She recognized that the omission, though unintentional, had transmitted a subtle message that his accomplishment, his efforts, and by extension his presence in the relationship were not fully recognized or valued. This realization brought with it a wave of introspection, compelling her to examine the relational patterns that had allowed such an oversight to occur. She considered her habitual focus on daily tasks, obligations, and personal priorities, understanding how these tendencies, while often necessary for functional life management, could inadvertently eclipse relational mindfulness and emotional attunement. Emotionally, she felt a complex mixture of guilt, remorse, and growing empathy for his experience. She imagined the pride and excitement he had felt when he shared the news, the anticipation of a supportive reaction, and the subtle disappointment that might have arisen in the absence of acknowledgement. Each imagined moment intensified her sense of responsibility and highlighted the relational significance of what she had initially perceived as a minor lapse. She explored the psychological impact of recognition, noting that human beings are wired to perceive acknowledgement as validation not just of achievements but of self-worth, relational value, and emotional relevance. In failing to celebrate his promotion, she realized she had unintentionally diminished the emotional resonance of the milestone, potentially creating a sense of invisibility or underappreciation that could influence his perception of their connection and his sense of intimacy within the relationship. The chapter also delved into her self-reflection regarding patterns of inattention and oversight, acknowledging that while her intentions were not dismissive, the cumulative effect of repeated minor neglect could undermine trust, emotional alignment, and the sense of being seen and valued. She considered how the lack of timely acknowledgement might have prompted him to question her attentiveness, commitment, and emotional engagement, subtly shaping his behavior and emotional responses in ways that she had only begun to perceive. In parallel, she examined her internal dialogue, recognizing the tension between self-focused priorities and relational attentiveness, the need for balance between managing personal responsibilities and maintaining the emotional vitality of shared life. She began to map strategies for re-engagement, understanding that repair required both internal cognitive realignment and deliberate external action. This included recognizing the importance of verbal acknowledgement, intentional gestures, and shared experiences that could reinforce his value, validate his efforts, and restore relational confidence. The chapter emphasized the interplay between awareness and action, illustrating that acknowledgement is not merely an emotional luxury, but a critical mechanism for sustaining trust, intimacy, and mutual validation. By the end of this reflection, she had developed a nuanced understanding of the emotional and relational stakes involved, the subtle cues that communicate attention and value, and the necessity of translating insight into consistent, meaningful actions to restore balance, reassurance, and connection within their partnership. She was poised to navigate the delicate process of re-engaging, reconnecting, and demonstrating the significance of his achievements, setting the foundation for subsequent chapters focused on consequences, reconciliation, and relational integration. The emotional consequences of her oversight began to manifest in subtle but persistent ways, revealing the depth of the relational impact she had previously underestimated. She observed changes in his demeanor that were almost imperceptible at first, the careful modulation of his tone and conversation, the restrained enthusiasm when sharing achievements, and the faint hesitations that hinted at a sense of being unrecognized or undervalued. These subtle shifts were amplified by the accumulation of moments in which her attention had been diverted or her acknowledgement delayed, forming a quiet undercurrent of emotional distance that she could no longer ignore. Internally, she experienced a mixture of guilt, anxiety, and a deepening empathy for his experience, recognizing that what had seemed like a minor lapse had ripple effects that influenced his perception of their emotional connection. She reflected on the psychology of relational responsiveness, understanding that the acknowledgement of milestones functions not only as recognition of achievement but also as affirmation of presence, value, and relational significance. Each uncelebrated moment created a potential void in which he might feel unseen, leading to subtle questioning of the alignment between his efforts, his emotional investment, and the perception of his importance within the partnership. She considered the cumulative weight of these small omissions, realizing how easily neglect, even unintentional, can erode trust, intimacy, and emotional resonance over time. Her thoughts extended to the broader dynamics of human connection, recognizing that relational satisfaction is heavily influenced by consistent validation, acknowledgement, and attentiveness. She explored the ways in which her prior distraction and preoccupation with daily routines had inadvertently communicated disengagement, and how these patterns, if left unaddressed, could foster a growing sense of invisibility in the relationship. Emotionally, she navigated the tension between self reflection and proactive responsibility, understanding that awareness alone was insufficient to repair the relational impact. Deliberate, thoughtful action was necessary to restore equilibrium and confidence. She examined possible interventions, verbal acknowledgement, intentional gestures, quality time, and sincere expressions of pride and support, each evaluated for authenticity, timing, and emotional resonance. In parallel, she reflected on the ways in which relational repair requires both patience and persistence, recognizing that rebuilding confidence and emotional closeness is an iterative process rather than a singular event. She analyzed the psychological mechanisms by which minor oversights influence perception, noting how repeated unacknowledged moments can accumulate into significant emotional distance, affecting not only individual satisfaction but also the trajectory of intimacy and partnership. The chapter also considered the relational feedback loop. His subtle withdrawal in response to feeling unnoticed could further compound her sense of responsibility, prompting heightened self-awareness, anxiety, and the recognition that intentional engagement was essential to prevent further erosion of connection. By the end of the stage, she had developed a comprehensive understanding of the relational stakes involved, the nuanced interplay between acknowledgement, perception, and emotional resonance, and the importance of translating awareness into concrete, consistent actions. She recognized that addressing the subtle emotional consequences of her oversight required both introspection and deliberate practice of attentiveness, ensuring that he felt seen, valued, and supported, and that their relationship could recover and strengthen from the lapse in recognition that had initially gone unnoticed. Recognizing the depth of the emotional gap that had formed, she embarked on the deliberate work of reconciliation, understanding that awareness alone could not repair what had been unintentionally damaged. She began to strategize ways to demonstrate acknowledgement, appreciation, and attentiveness in a manner that was both genuine and consistent, recognizing that superficial gestures would fail to convey the sincerity required to restore trust and emotional intimacy. Her reflections centered on the subtle balance between verbal affirmation and tangible actions, understanding that acknowledgement operates both in the explicit expression of pride and in the quiet reinforcement of presence, attention, and shared joy. She considered how to integrate gestures into daily life, small celebrations, thoughtful notes, moments of focused attention that could collectively signal her awareness of his achievements and the value she placed on his contributions both professionally and personally. Emotionally, she navigated vulnerability, confronting the discomfort of admitting oversight and the fear that her attempts at reconciliation might be perceived as belated or insufficient. She recognized that authentic repair required humility, empathy, and a willingness to engage fully with the relational consequences of her actions rather than minimizing or rationalizing them. In constructing her approach, she paid close attention to his cues, interpreting subtle shifts in mood, tone, and behavior as indicators of both ongoing emotional impact and receptiveness to re-engagement. Each interaction became a potential opportunity to rebuild confidence, reaffirm emotional alignment, and restore a sense of mutual appreciation that had been disrupted. She also reflected on the iterative nature of relational repair, acknowledging that a single gesture or acknowledgement could not fully rectify the impact of her oversight, but that consistent, intentional engagement could gradually restore balance, intimacy, and mutual trust. Her internal process involved involved reconciling her own patterns of distraction and preoccupation with the necessity of relational attentiveness, recognizing that sustaining connection requires conscious prioritization of both emotional and symbolic milestones. She explored the mechanisms by which acknowledgement reinforces relational satisfaction by validating effort, demonstrating attentiveness, and signaling that each partner's achievements and contributions are valued and visible. She examined the potential emotional risks and rewards of her actions, understanding that sincere engagement could rebuild his sense of being seen and appreciated, while inauthentic or inconsistent attempts might exacerbate feelings of invisibility or underappreciation. Throughout this stage, she balanced reflection with action, translating insight into deliberate, thoughtful behaviors designed to reestablish emotional resonance. She contemplated the timing, context, and manner of her expressions, recognizing that the delivery of acknowledgement is as important as the acknowledgement itself. By the end of this chapter, she had developed a clear framework for relational repair: consistent, genuine acknowledgement, integration of supportive gestures into daily life, careful observation of emotional cues, and iterative reinforcement of connection through both words and actions. She felt a growing sense of empowerment and responsibility, understanding that the restoration of trust, intimacy, and emotional alignment depended on sustained attentiveness and the deliberate practice of demonstrating recognition, appreciation, and care in meaningful ways that could rebuild the relational equilibrium disrupted by her initial oversight. By the final stage, she had moved beyond reflection and initial attempts at repair to a deeper integration of the lessons learned, fully understanding how her oversight had influenced both his perception of their relationship and the subtle dynamics of their emotional connection. She recognized that acknowledgement, attentiveness, and celebration of milestones are not mere formalities but essential mechanisms that convey care, value, and mutual respect. Each unrecognized achievement, each overlooked moment, carries emotional weight, subtly shaping trust, intimacy, and the sense of being seen. She reflected on the journey from initial inattention to deliberate engagement, noting how small, consistent gestures, verbal affirmations, and thoughtful acts could rebuild his confidence in her attentiveness and reaffirm the value of their shared partnership. She considered the balance between personal preoccupations and relational mindfulness, understanding that sustaining emotional resonance requires conscious prioritization, the willingness to notice, and the active practice of expressing appreciation and validation. Her awareness now encompassed the relational feedback loop, the interplay between his perceptions, her responses, and the mutual reinforcement of connection through acknowledgement and care. She recognized that restoration is not instantaneous but accumulative, relying on consistent demonstration of engagement, empathy, and attentiveness over time. Emotionally, she felt a profound sense of responsibility and commitment, understanding that relational resilience depends on the integration of insight into habitual behavior, ensuring that recognition of achievements and milestones becomes embedded in the ongoing patterns of interaction. She contemplated the broader lessons for her own growth: the importance of mindfulness, the impact of small gestures, the necessity of balancing self-focus with attentiveness to the other, and the powerful role of intentional acknowledgement in sustaining relational intimacy. The chapter explored how these insights could transform her approach to the partnership, emphasizing proactive engagement, sincere expression of appreciation, and careful observation of emotional cues to prevent future lapses and reinforce a sense of being valued. She reflected on the psychological mechanisms by which acknowledgement reinforces relational satisfaction, noting that recognition communicates validation, strengthens emotional bonds, and fosters trust and mutual investment. Each interaction henceforth became an opportunity to consolidate connection, repair prior disruption, and cultivate a relational environment in which both partners feel seen, respected, and appreciated. By the conclusion of this stage, she had internalized the essential principle that the maintenance of intimacy and emotional resonance requires vigilance, empathy, and deliberate action. Awareness alone is insufficient without consistent practice of acknowledgement and celebration. She now understood that sustaining a meaningful partnership involves attentiveness to both the monumental and the seemingly minor milestones, translating insight into concrete behaviors that demonstrate care, presence, and validation. The chapter closed with her integration of these lessons into her ongoing relational practice, a commitment to sustaining attentiveness, celebrating achievements, and maintaining emotional alignment, ensuring that both she and her partner feel recognized, valued, and connected in the evolving landscape of their shared life.
Thanks for watching. It means a lot. Share the video, and I'll see you soon.